Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our event today. I'm Mike O'Hanlon with the Brookings Institution, and I'm privileged to welcome you to a book launch for Jay Sankaran, who's written an excellent book on bombing to provoke, as he calls it. And it's a book about, as the subtitle conveys, about rockets, drones, and missiles as instruments of fear and coercion in warfare, with a number of interesting case studies and some applications for today's world as well. And we'll get into all of that in just a minute. Let me first say that Jay, as well as Sarah Krebs and Bruce Rydell, are all part of the same center that I'm part of at Brookings, the Strobe Talbot Center on Security, Strategy, and Technology. And we've all been privileged to work under Strobe Talbot's broader initiative here in honor of our former president. And in the case of all three, they're now non-resident senior fellows in various parts of the country. So we're delighted to have the opportunity to have this conversation by Zoom. Jay is at the University of Texas, and we're not going to get into a discussion of NCAA football, but we are going to enjoy talking about his book. He's a professor at the LBJ School of Public Policy there. Sarah Krebs is a professor of government and also part of the policy school at Cornell University and directs Technology Policy Institute, which is also the subject of her ongoing work and forthcoming book. And we'll look forward to her commentary on these issues of warfare, but also of technology. So it's very natural to have her as part of the discussion, and we're grateful for her participation. And my longstanding colleague and friend, Bruce Rydell, who's now a semi-retired scholar, but Bruce is never really retired and is always very active after an amazing career in the CIA and government, and then an amazing career for 15 years at Brookings, where he set the record for number of books. I think covered almost every single Middle Eastern country in his writing career, and certainly has followed very carefully the situation in Yemen with the Houthi, which is one of the case studies in Jay's book and one of the things we'll talk about today. So we'll get started here in just a second. My main plan as moderator is to first ask Jay to lay out the main argument of the book and his main methodology for establishing his argument. And then we'll turn to first Sarah and then Bruce for commentary on the overall argument of the book. And then we may already have gotten into the contemporary world in that discussion, but we'll come back for a second round where I will ask Jay to apply his theory to what's been going on in the world tragically over the last 3 years in Ukraine and the last 1 year plus in the Middle East, especially in Israel and Gaza. And so we will sort of see, in a sense, how well the theory works to explain these cases and whether there's any nuance or tweaking or caveating that needs to be done to adjust for these cases as well. I always think the best social science is social science that doesn't try to be 100% predictive or have a theory that proves everything in an airtight way, because I'm not sure the world really works that way. So I think nuance and caveats are actually appropriate and necessary in these kinds of discussions. So without further ado, again, thank you very much. We will, to the audience, involve you with your questions in the final 15 minutes or so, maybe a little longer, of today's discussion. So feel free to send them to, actually, let me get the update from my colleague. I think we send messages. I'll wait. I'll comment on this in a minute again, but I think it's going to be to an email address through Brookings that will provide you in just a few minutes if you haven't already seen it on the invitation. But I'll come back on that. And Jay, again, congratulations on the book from Oxford Press, coming out now and available, 2024 copyright. Look forward to hearing about it. My friend, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mike. Let me begin by, again, thanking Brookings and for the Talbot Center and you for to do this, to set this up, and there's a lot of process involved. And I also start by thanking both Dr. Krebs and Bruce Rydell for taking the time to comment on the book. I should point out that I have extensively borrowed and reframed their arguments. Dr. Sarah's book on a drone and Bruce's writing on the Houthi conflict wrote my chapters very easily for me. So again, my thanks to them for doing this and for being here. So what I want to do in the roughly next 10 to 12 minutes is I'll begin by quickly jumping into my PowerPoint slides, which will set up the framework for how I came up to the question I posed in the book and how I theorize about it. And then I'll come out of the PowerPoint slides, have a little bit more conversation about theory and its predictions, and then we'll have a conversation. All right, so let me do screen share. Okay. Right, perfect. So the question I pose in the book is how do these weapons, I call them aerospace weapons, rockets, missiles, drones, work as instruments of fear and coercion, right? But in arriving at this question, I think there's an interesting anecdote to be told that both illustrates the value of asking this question, but also the value of building a theory around the question, right? And that I have to go back to the 1991 Gulf War, which is how I got to this question. So at the early stages of the 1991 Gulf War, there was a lot of debate on Saddam Hussein and his Scud missiles and its influence impact on Israel. Right now, Schwarzkopf, who was the commander-in-chief of the coalition forces during the 91 Gulf War, was very clear. Right? His argument was that saying the Scud missile is a threat to a danger is like saying a lightning is a danger to a nation. Right? I would be personally more afraid of standing in a lightning storm in southern Georgia than I would be in the streets of Tel Aviv and Saudi Arabia. Right? So again, his argument was that this is not really a threat. Right? And then he also talks about this in his book on how he felt the Scud missile threat manifested itself and why he didn't think it was a serious threat. And he describes this very meticulously. He says, what day the Iraqi Saddam Hussein had was a weapon that could fly 300 miles, miss the target by a couple of miles with a warhead of 160 pounds. And then he says that's militarily equivalent of a single plane flying over haphazardly, dropping one small bomb and flying away, right? Terrible for anyone it happened to land on, but in the grand scheme of warfare, it's a mosquito, right? Right, he gives all this detail and he says, well, it's really not a problem. We shouldn't be worried about it. And he would not be, from a strictly kinetic military tactical estimation perspective, wrong, right? And to illustrate the point, I'm going to employ my favorite tool to make that case. So there is the Brookings building, right? And we have a target. Right? Now, if the target was Brookings building, and if I had Saddam Hussein's Scud, the missile has to land in this nice circle. Right? We know how far it can fly. We also have a good idea of what a CP was. CP is the accuracy measure that was roughly 2 miles. The warhead weight is known. And so you say, well, okay, if you have a distinct target, how close do you have to be to that? This is where you have to be. This is where the missile would land, right? There's a 50% chance that Saddam Hussein's missile, a single missile fired targeting the Brookings institution, would fall somewhere in this circle, right? So again, this illustrates the point that Schwarzkopf was not wrong. Right? In the grand scheme of things, from a purely military tactical perspective, the weapon did not matter, right? But from a psychological strategic perspective, it was immensely powerful in forcing decision makers to act. And again, I have a very inspiring preferred quote that kind of makes my story for me, right? Dick Cheney is the Secretary of Defense during the 91 Gulf War, and he constantly is arguing and butting heads with the military leadership, the American military leadership operating out of Kuwait, right? Asking them to divert more and more military resources to address this threat, which the military leaders have tactically decided was not significant enough. At one point early in the war, he says, as long as I'm Secretary of Defense, the DoD will do as I tell them. I want you to put more planes on these targets. You need to do it. And then 2 weeks later, when he is frustrated that the DoD is not doing enough, I discovered this very angry statement from him in my archival research, right? He says, God damn it, I want some airplanes out there, right? I mean, so here the point being illustrated is that even though the weapon from a military tactical perspective was limited, from a strategic, political, psychological perspective, it demanded more and more resources. And the US was not alone in wanting this. The Israelis were demanding it. Right. And again, there's a nice story to be told about how the Israelis thought about this particular case study. But this statement is very illustrative. This is again in the middle of the war. Moshe Aarons is visiting the White House, and he, in a conversation with President George H.W. Bush, says, there's a feeling in Israel. Right? Again, the word feeling I've highlighted, it's a perspective, right? Some 31 Scuds have been launched, some killed, hundreds injured, resulting in scenes not seen in the West since World War II. Right? Very dramatic. But what really happened was there was 2 Israelis who were killed, and I think there were 7 accidental related deaths. Right? Again, in the grand scheme of things, not a big number, but from the Israeli perspective, they felt this as being hugely impactful. The Scud missiles, as I argue in the book, weaponized fear, activated Israeli demands for American diversion of military resources, and the American political leadership did that despite pushback from the American military that you don't really have to do it. Right? So at the end of the war, in the 91 Gulf War, we had done close to 2,500 anti-Scud sorties. That number was huge by the standards of that particular war. Those sorties exceeded that we used for SEAD, which is suppression of enemy air defenses, targeting their air defense radars. It was more than the destruction of or the number of sorties used for the destruction of military production facilities, the line of communication attacks. So again, you put all these together, it still didn't breach the 2,500 mark we did for Scuds. Okay. At one point, there were 400 Delta commandos who were sent into Iraq to hunt Scud missiles. I believe 20 to 30 were killed in the process. Entire areas were targeted with bombs. And at one point, fighter pilots were instructed to drop bomb every half hour in specific distances just to intimidate Iraqi missile crews. So this is how I got into this question, right? I mean, why is this effect? When military leaders clearly saw this as a tactical, small, limited weapon with very limited effects, the political effect and the demand for diversion was very huge. Right? And that's how I got into the question. How do I explain it? Is there a broader argument to be seen? And can I frame a coherent theory? So again, I looked at World War II, same story, right? There's a nice circle on DC with Saddam Hussein's Scud. You talk about V1, V2 missiles with Hitler, and the entire missile area is Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, DC, right? But again, the effect is very constant, and you can come back to Hezbollah, much tighter circles, but the effect still plays out. So in order to explain this, I look at 5 case studies. I look at World War II. I look at the Iran-Iraq war, where the Iraqi missiles at the end game, I argue, played a huge role in how Iran decided to accept a ceasefire proposal, the 91 Gulf War, the 2006 Lebanon war between Israel and Hezbollah, and the Yemeni war between the Houthis and the Saudi-led coalition that went from 2014 to 2022. I look at all of these. In all of these, I can observe this effect. The weapon by itself from a purely military kinetic perspective seems limited, but from an operational, psychological, strategic perspective seems to be hugely impactful in provoking and forcing a diversion of resources. Now, not in all cases does the provocation lead to clear concessions. In some cases, it doesn't. But in at least 3 cases, I argue and I classify that the provocation, in fact, led to bargaining and concession from the stronger party to the weaker party. Those 3 cases were the Iran-Iraq war in 1980 to 1988, the 2006 Second Lebanon War, and the Yemeni war, in which case the stronger party or relatively stronger party made some concessions to end the war because, or in part, by the role played by these aerospace weapons. So those are the 5 case studies. And then having looked at these case studies, I frame a theoretical argument where I make these claims. The bombing to provoke theory is based on the notion that these weapons provoke and coerce by weaponizing fear. Does not mean there is a tactical reason to act, but the tactical reason to act is often significantly amplified by this weaponized fear, the psychology of it, that triggers a sense of vulnerability and defenselessness among the targeted population and its decision makers. They have to feel vulnerable, they have to feel a need to react. So this I call the appraisal tendencies in the book. Being subjected to missile bombardment or a rocket bombardment or drone bombardment changes how we appraise a threat. Right? Even though military leaders appraised the threat in the 91 Gulf War, for instance, as very limited, the common political appraisal was no, it is in fact a significant threat, we need to act. There's a rational angle to it, but there's also an emotional, psychological aspect to it. Right? And when your appraisal tendency is changed, your action tendencies also change. Right? One way to think about this would be 9/11, right? How we looked at the threat of terrorism immediately after 9/11 and how we decided to overreact in some ways. The same thing happens here. So there's an appraisal tendency, we overestimate the threat, and there's an action tendency where we go in and try and extinguish the threat. And that process is how the provocation happens. There is a diversion, there's a huge effort to suppress the threat. And finally, the argument I make in the book is that states that are actually able to divert and eventually suppress the threat don't end up making concessions, but states that are either unable to divert the resources to defend and suppress the threat or will suffer in some cases a dilution of the resolve and will be forced to offer concessions. That is the essence of the argument using these 5 case studies. With that, I will stop and we will jump into a conversation.
Jay, that's fantastic. I just have one quick clarifying question before I turn to Sarah Krebs and Bruce Rydell. And again, very nicely done. I want to congratulate you for the good use of quotes and the vivid, comments, and also the very good maps in reference, for example, to Operation Desert Storm and the Scud attacks against Israel in particular. My clarifying question, you made a brief mention at the end of the 9/11 attacks and the kind of emotional response that created in the United States and what policy responses that led to. Do you want to also, would you have an asterisk that would include airplanes used as suicide weapons as also part of the same general phenomenon? Is that what you meant by that comment? Or was that just sort of an aside that didn't really try to fit 9/11 into your theory?
Thanks, Mike. So the reason I brought 9/11 was the term provocation is more explicitly used in terrorism studies in political science literature. And so I borrowed that idea from there, right? I mean, the idea being that, and in fact, the suicide terrorism is in fact the classic example of provocation. Right? I mean, they're not going to win a war, but they're going to force the other side to react, which leads to more recruits and more funding. So hence the link to 9/11 as a example to re-illustrate the phenomena. But you're right, airplanes used as suicide bombs, like the kamikaze attacks or other instances could certainly be other examples, absolutely.
I remember also, I think it was Admiral Nimitz after World War II, who gave a speech towards the end of his life, maybe at Newport at the Naval War College, where he said that the only Japanese tactic that they had not anticipated from war gaming that was done in the 1930s was in fact the kamikaze. So anyway, just an aside, but thank you very much. And now if I could go to Sarah and then Bruce for your reactions. And again, just for the audience and your awareness, we're going to see Sarah and Bruce take different angles at this. They'll explain their own approach, but just trying to enrich the conversation as we understand the book and its ramifications. So thank you. And Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Mike, and congratulations, Jay, on this excellent book. And as you were talking, I really appreciated, I mean, I've read the book, but I appreciated the additional contextualization. And I couldn't help but feel vindicated as a former Air Force person myself, that was in the service in the late 90s and early 2000s with the air power debates then saying, air power can't win wars. And now I feel like decades later, you're showing that, in fact, air power can be very successful in the context of war. But I'm going to actually kind of play devil's advocate a little bit and see whether I can push you a little bit on the theory and the argument. So I had a couple of comments or questions in that vein. And so one of the core mechanisms, it seems, of your argument is that at the center of this coercive and provocative logic of aerospace weapons is this idea of fear and the psychology around that. And I find that compelling. And that is different, I think, from what those air power debates were in the 90s and 2000s that were focused so much on, well, air power can't hold territory. And what you're saying is that's not really so much the point, because what's happening is fear is influencing these political and military actions. But I wondered if there were some way, and I'm kind of now speaking as a social scientist on this, sort of some way to tease out or separate out the difference or the effect. You're basically trying to say that it's the holding the effect constant. It's that aerospace weapons are instilling fear in ways that shape these reactions. But I started to think about kind of variations on this. Would there be some way to compare these that mechanism with alternative forms of warfare? Is there a way in which is this restricted to aerospace weapons, or is there a way in which ground forces could instill that same fear? What about naval forces? And that got me thinking about whether it's the novelty of these aspects of aerospace weapons, like Mike was just saying, that, we're used to ground forces, and now you come out with this like suicide kind of tactic of World War II, or drones that people weren't used to, or Scuds, sort of the novelty of it versus how that psychology is embedding or the effect of novelty, or is it the noise, for example? And that also made me wonder about variation within these different weapons. So one of the things I've focused more on is drones in counterterrorism contexts. And in that setting, let's say in the tribal regions of Pakistan, one of the things that really emerges is that kind of psychology of the 24/7 surveillance, that it instills fear in those local populations, and that's a big aspect of it. But is that really what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, where it's not a counterterrorism setting, but these are just weapons of war that are used over and over again? And so I guess my question is to see what you think about variation, both within a certain type of weapon, let's say drones, but also between drones or sort of aerospace weapons and alternative forms of warfare, to help us get at the focus of your argument, which is the fear and the psychology.
Jay, do you want to take that now, or do you want to hear from Bruce first?
I think I'll take it now. I think there's multiple moving parts. It may help to get to it right away. Right. Fantastic. Thanks, Sarah. That helps a lot. So let me go through your series of questions and see where my argument fits in. So I don't think my argument is completely opposed to air power theory as a social science structured air power theory, right? One of the big arguments in air power theory is it's an instrument for the strong actor, right? You have air superiority. In all my case studies, that was not the issue here. The other argument was core interest is at play, and I'm channeling Bob Pape here, right? I mean, but again, what is core interest by itself is such a difficult question to get to. But in at least the cases in which concession was made, the core interest was not at play, right? I mean, the Saudis could pull back from Yemen without suffering any huge core interest costs. There may have been small reputational costs, right? So again, in the book, I try to find these gaps and say, look, there are ways you can accept my argument without being completely dismissive or completely challenging the air power theory, right? And the way I frame this argument again is to make the case that it may not, well, while air power may not be war-winning weapon, right? It has a huge impact on war. And once you start saying that it's not 0-1, it's between something 0 and 1, there's a huge story to be told. And that's where historians have done fantastic work in air power, surprisingly fantastic work about looking about even World War II, right? What we generally air power theory would classify as the US CBO, the combined bomber operation, as 0. Historians have said that's not true. Look at all the substitution that's happened in the German economy and how that has influenced their war fighting strategy, right? So that I think is how my book comes in that big argument, that I think it's influential, especially for weak actors who are trying to provoke and bargain with a stronger actor when core interest is not at play, right? So I think that answers the first part of the question. I think the second part of the question was, is this novelty? Can we observe this phenomenon in other instances? Same weapon, different wars, different weapon, different wars, right? I think the answer is yes. So the example for different weapon, different war would be, I mean, we can talk about the October 7 attack, right? The Hamas attack on Israel. Highly dramatic, right? But they breached it with trucks and cars and guns, right? But the state of Israel felt extremely violated and provoked, right? I mean, and we can look at multiple other examples. I have to admit, I haven't thought about armed forces having the same effect, but my guess is there are instances where that has happened, when there are other phenomena going in, when you don't anticipate a threat, or when you don't anticipate that particular cost of a threat, I think is when it gets amplified, when the fear gets amplified in that context. So same weapon, different wars, how does it change? That's a very interesting question. And I think we're kind of jumping into what does it mean for Russia, Ukraine, or Hezbollah and Israel. The Russia-Ukraine was very interesting. Up to 2-3 weeks ago, I was struggling, right? I mean, it's 12,000 missiles, drones, and rockets, twice that of World War II, and the effect seemed much muted. But I think 2-3 weeks ago, there was this burst of news about the Qataris mediating a talk between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And the entire talk was pivoted on the assumption that you don't shoot at my energy and I won't shoot at your oil-producing installations. And there's this nice quote I picked up from Zelensky. He essentially says, in his motivation for pursuing the deal, he says, we do not attack their energy. They do not attack our energy. Does this lead to the end of the hot stage? I think so, because this is a part of the war that is very dangerous for us, right? I mean, it's not war winning. It's not determining the outcome, but it's influencing the outcome in a specific way I look at it. Which is striking critical vulnerable targets to force the other side to make concessions or to provoke them. Right? So I think my argument still plays out in the Russia-Ukraine war, but it's also much broader. They're also using it for a whole bunch of purposes, especially drones. So it's also playing its role as a strictly military instrument, either for surveillance and strike. So again, I think I see echoes of my argument in that war, among other possible pathways to use drones. So I don't think the argument fails to explain some phenomena, but it doesn't explain every phenomena in the Russia-Ukraine war, is how I'd answer the question.
Thank you. Unless, Sarah, you wanted to follow up quickly with something else, we'll go to Bruce now and then come back again to everybody for a second round. Great. Bruce, my friend, over to you. By the way, while Bruce is unmuting, let me say that the email address to send in questions is events@brookings.edu. One more time, events@brookings.edu. And let me also apologize for wearing sunglasses to save my beleaguered eyes on the computer screen. But Bruce, thanks for joining us, and now look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Mike. Before I go into the body of what I wanted to talk about, I must offer one personal vignette. In 1991, I was deputy chief of the CIA's Persian Gulf Task Force. And Jay, you've got it absolutely right. CENTCOM did not want to go scud hunting in Western Iraq. But one additional point, when they finally did take on the mission of going scud hunting, they continued to report every day that we have destroyed blank, blank, blank numbers of scud launchers, and we're blowing up them constantly. Well, in fact, they didn't blow up anything. They completely missed them. They blew up a lot of people's trucks. They blew up some of their own army's trucks. But when the war was all over and we had access to the Iraqi scud force, we found that we hadn't hit a single scud through the whole war. Let me turn from that to the case study of Yemen, which I think there's an excellent case study in the book. It really illustrates the point about a small actor being able to provoke a larger actor and in the end, ultimately to win a conflict. For 7 years, beginning in 2015, the Royal Saudi Air Force led a coalition of Arab air forces in air attacks on the Houthi rebels largely in northern Yemen. The Houthis are Zaidi Shias. They are militantly nationalistic. They are militantly anti-American and anti-Israeli. When the Saudis began this operation, which they called Decisive Storm, they were confident that the war would be over in a matter of weeks. In the end, they were a complete failure. And it took them 7 years to come around to making a deal for a ceasefire, left the Houthis entirely in charge of the area they had, and in fact, in charge of 85% of the Yemeni population. The Houthis, in the prospects of the war, also fired many, many rockets into southern Saudi Arabia and fired missiles and drones at Riyadh, Jeddah, and other Saudi cities, and even Abu Dhabi. They were successful in leading to terrorizing much of the Saudi population, especially in the border regions around Yemen, and many of them fleeing their homes. They were also successful in driving away foreign investment from the kingdom, and it threatened to do the same to the United Arab Emirates. Finally, in the end, the Saudis recognized that this just wasn't working, and they essentially made a deal which left the Houthis in charge of Yemen. Now we have a similar situation going on. Since the start of the Israel-Gaza war, the Houthis have begun attacking maritime traffic in the Red Sea and attacking Israel directly with missiles and drones. This began on the 19th of October. They have said from the beginning that this is in solidarity with Hamas in Gaza, and that it will continue to go on until there is an end to the Israeli military operations in Gaza. Now, the number of ships that have actually been damaged by these missions are very few, but the very fact that there are these attacks going on in the Red Sea has increased the insurance rate for sailing through the Red Sea exponentially. In order to suppress the Houthi attack, the United States, with the assistance of the United Kingdom and a few other states, have engaged in significant airstrikes against Houthi targets, including in one case using a B-2 stealth bomber. Just to remind you, a B-2 stealth bomber costs $2 billion per plane, which in practical terms means about $135,000 is spent in each fuel hour that a mission takes place. That's an incredible amount of expenditure against what is essentially a very, very technologically obsolete Houthi missile force. The Israelis have also bombed Yemen now, which is one of the longest strikes in the history of the Israel Defense Forces. But none of this has any significant impact on the Houthis or their attacks on Israel and Red Sea shipping. The Houthis are intact. They haven't seen their headquarters and communication systems disrupted. They haven't been any significant impact in the number of Houthi attacks. while on the other hand, their impact is quite significant. According to the Defense Intelligence Agency, there's been a 90% drop in container ship traffic using the Red Sea, and that also means using the Suez Canal, which means that canal revenues for Egypt have gone down significantly. Israel saw an 85% drop in maritime activity at its port of Eilat on the Gulf of Aqaba. The activity was so significantly curtailed that the Port Authority has now gone bankrupt and fired all of its employees, having a significant economic impact on the city of Eilat. They have struck Tel Aviv. One of their missiles almost struck the U.S. consulate in Tel Aviv, where I used to work. One person was killed in that strike. We have no figures on how much damage to the economy of Jordan has come from the lack of activity in the Red Sea, but Jordan's only port, Aqaba, is on the Red Sea approaches, and one would assume its economic activity has gone down considerably as well. So we can see that in a year of this conflict, 3 American allies, Israel, Egypt, and probably Jordan, have been harmed substantially by this activity, from a relatively obscure militia terror group in Yemen, as has the overall global economy. So it is a classic example of the book's thesis that a small power using aerospace weapons can upset the global order and bring a stronger power ultimately to come to have to learn with the existence of the Houthi threat. And I will stop with that.
Bruce, that's great. Thank you very, very much. Excellent application of the theory and case study on Yemen. I wonder, Jay, if you want to respond to Bruce and then also think about more generally speaking to current events and bringing in also beyond what you've already done, the Israel, Gaza, Palestine situation, and anything further you have to say on Ukraine as well, but with a specific eye towards responding to Bruce. Over to you.
Sure thing. Thanks, Mike. And thanks again, Bruce. I'm glad you liked the chapter on the Houthi rebels. And as I said, I borrowed extensively from your scholarship, and it's glad to know that it landed well. So again, I'm in complete agreement. In fact, the Houthis were very interesting. The case study in the book was the war with the Saudis. And of all the case studies I had, in my theory, I say one of the ways these weak actors should use these weapons is they should use this to bargain. The Houthis provided the strongest evidence of that bargaining argument. They'd fire 2 missiles into Saudi Arabia and say, well, now I fired 2 missiles. You last week dropped 10 bombs. Do you want to talk now? If you talk, I want bomb. And if you don't talk, I'm going to bomb more. They had a very active public affairs office constantly doing it. Right? It was systematic, and none of the other actors did. I mean, the actions led to smaller conversations or diplomatic exchanges, but the Houthis did it publicly, clearly demonstrating this argument that they were trying to bargain. Right? You can hit me with 10 plane load worth of bombs. I can fire 4 missiles. You will have more pain than I do because my tolerance is high. Do you want to bargain? And they did this throughout the war, so that fits nicely into the pattern of the theory. And now, of course, as Bruce pointed out, there are attempts to affect the trade on the Red Sea using all these weapons and reportedly using Soviet supplied targeting data. I saw a news item on that. So again, imposing significant costs, right? The provocation effect is very clear. And in fact, in preparation for this conversation, I looked at what the US Navy was saying. Rear Admiral Fred Pyle, who is in charge or who deals with the operation to suppress the Houthi threat, that's called the Operation Prosperity Guardian, is on record saying, we have not seen naval action with such intensity since probably World War II. Right? I mean, huge effort to suppress the Houthi forces from being able to disrupt the trade. So the provocation is very clear. They are taking a hit, but they are bearing the cost, and they are coming back and imposing a cost on us and the Israelis and a bunch of American allies. It's still yet to be seen how that cost translates into some bargaining leverage. The war is unfolding. My guess is it will have some leverage effect. It won't be zero. It may not be phenomenally great, but it may be part of the conversation how the Israeli conflict ends. So again, no critic on Bruce's argument. I'm in agreement. And I'm very surprised at how quickly they could, in fact, disrupt the trade. I think 20-30% disruption in trade, at least at a minimum, is what people have said. So continuing that conversation on the Hezbollah-Israel conflict that's now going on. Now that is a challenging case in more ways than one. And Mike, you said, not every theory can explain everything. And, was I stumped? Was I surprised? So before the Israelis went and took action against the Hezbollah forces, a lot of us, including me, would have said they had this 150,000 strong arsenal. It's going to be phenomenally destructive, right? Hezbollah is going to rain rockets down. That has happened, but not to the effect that I would have anticipated. Right? So that's the interesting part. Now, I do think the theory still plays out. The trigger for Israelis to going in was a combination of two factors: the persistent Hezbollah rocket fire, and then the possibility that the Rizwan forces would breach the border and attack Israeli civilians. So in that way, the Hezbollah pressure did provoke them, and they go in more forcefully. So I see that happening. But how quickly the rocket forces became less potent than what we had expected was a little surprising to me. They're still firing rockets. It's not gone down. I believe the daily average is around 75. Daily average was around 75. We expected 1,500 per day. I think just yesterday they fired 250 rockets because the Israelis were evaluating a potential agreement, and they want to say, you don't sign the agreement, I have this means to hurt you, is how people are interpreting it. So again, a lot of things happening that fits into the argument I make. The Hezbollah forces have used their rocket force to provoke and bargain. I think they've also caused enough pain on themselves than they would have anticipated in the way Israel reacted. I think it's worth seeing why and what gaps the theory fills there. And finally, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. As I said, the most interesting thing for me was the interwar bargaining that apparently had happened in Qatar. It looks like within the Ukrainian national security apparatus, there was no clear consensus. Some thought the Russians really would have struck a deal that would be a starting point to an end. Others thought they didn't. But the mere possibility that you can hit using drones at a few oil refining plants and impose a 15% reduction in Russian oil output that would enable to come to the bargaining table is huge. I mean, these were not massive missiles. These were mostly drones and one-way loitering munition kind of drones that Ukraine had used to potentially bring Russia to the table. And my understanding was Russia was willing to come to the table right before Ukrainian invasion into Russian territory. I mean, there was strong incentive for them to do it. So the theory again explains quite a few of what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine war. We need more details, but even the small details are what I would like to amplify and say that it gives credence to what I have made as an argument in my book.
Thank you, my friend. Very good. So let's go to another round with Sarah and then Bruce. Any further thoughts they want to put on the table or questions they want to pose to you? And then we've got a few questions already from the audience to wrap things up with the ongoing invitation to those listening to email us at events@brookings.edu, events@brookings.edu with any further questions. Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. I've enjoyed the back and forth here. Thanks to both Bruce and Jay on that. I guess I would come back and maybe piggyback a little bit on this kind of topic of cases and bring in again my broader questions on the framework and the kind of the conceptual thinking, Jay. And, you know, as Mike said too, it's not super helpful to have point predictions in this kind of methodology, but I was a little bit curious, again, just to kind of push the thinking a little bit. What case would make your analytical framework wrong? And so you had said in one of your previous comments about, you know, you had been surprised by something. So what, I guess, example or case could be a counter argument or prove you wrong analytically? And then maybe I'll just tack on sort of a related question for you about kind of the longer term implications of your argument, or sort of, you know, if a lot of your theory is about immediate provocation and coercion, but what about the longer term consequences of those campaigns? So can fear-driven overreactions, they might cause temporary diversions or concessions, but can't they also harden a state's resolve and lead to adaptive strategies or accelerate the development of countermeasures? And here I was thinking a little bit of Israel's Iron Dome, which was a response to kind of this barrage. So how would your theory account for these kind of iterative dynamics over time? Thanks, Jay.
Over to you, Jay.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Sarah. So let me take the second question first and then come back to the first question. I think I can answer both questions. I do. I have answers. To the second question, the argument I've made in the book is to, if you really have to suppress a aerospace threat, right? The way I've talked about in the book, you actually have to invade and hold territory. I mean, you can do defenses, you can do counterforce offensive bombing. It never really stops the threat. I mean, at least in the 5 case studies, that never happened, right? World War II, extensive bombing. They reanimated the entire defense they had for the Blitz, right? It didn't stop. The Germans adapted, the rate of firing goes down, but until they actually took the firing sites, it really didn't slow. That was true for the 1991 Gulf War. In 2006, Israel was never able to take territory, and so it really didn't stop until the very last day. So there are adaptive behaviors, but my argument is that because this is not a precise military campaign, all the other state has to do is fire a few, and things. And if the promise is I'm going to stop rockets coming and falling in my cities and oil refineries, it's very tough to do it without holding territory. I think that's what the 5 case studies say. And I said, well, unless you can do it, which means you have to commit fully to defeat the adversary on a battlefield and to end the war on terms you prefer. Right? World War II, 91 Gulf War again. If that is not being done, then the threat doesn't go away. And it's an irritating threat, but it still persists. So I think adaptive behaviors help, but it doesn't really solve the problem. The Iron Dome is a fascinating example. And I didn't look into the Hamas in my book, but after the book, I had, tried to think through it. And often in the case of Hamas, what happens in the Iron Dome is the Iron Dome shoots down missiles that are coming into populated areas, but not the ones that are going into unpopulated areas. But even those ones that fall like 10 or 50 meters away from a home, is as disturbing for the city as it is if it had fallen in, right? Because people think they know someone who was killed or hurt by a rocket and they think they are next, right? And they demand action from their political leaders. So I think adaptation does help, but I don't think it's going to solve the problem or the core fear component. It's conceivable it kind of falls down over time. But what also happens is the overreaction does require you to put military forces in, and that action leads to more death. That's the 2006 war, or that's what happens with the Saudis in Yemen. When the rockets come in, they go in and bomb, they lose a pilot or two. In the 2006 war, Israel sends in soldiers, but they die in more numbers than what actually the rockets are caused death. And that actually has a backlash effect too. Right? People say, well, why are so many of our citizens getting killed? When this is a small irritating problem, can we give them more access to the sea and get this done with? that has its own causal mechanism. The stakes have to be relatively low. Again, core interest should not be at play, but that's how I think it happens. So countermeasures help, but I don't think it solves the problem. If it is a military issue, it would have, because this is a psychological weapon. Looking at fear, I don't think it takes away the entire effectiveness of the strategy. Now to cycle back to the first question, right? When would my theory be wrong and dead wrong? I think the Armenia-Azerbaijan case is actually very interesting. That also happened after I had written the book, but I think maybe before it was published. So when the Azerbaijanis took back Nagorno-Karabakh, and I think I'm saying this right, drones and rockets, and actually drones played a huge part, but supplemented by, I think, rocket fire. And the way the Azerbaijanis did this was they used the drones and rocket fire to suppress the air defense network in this region, which was called, I think, an impregnable fortress before it fell. So the drone strategy was used not as a provocative, fear-inducing tool, but as a purely military tool, right? So they were weak actors or tactically weaker actors in comparison in the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict. And so they used it as a purely military tool, suppressed the radar system and quickly marched their army in and took the territory, which is which my theory would not have anticipated. But I haven't seen their internal debate to see what they thought. But the way it unfolded was, it was a classic air power in the military sense, military denial, not the punishment leading to military denial. So that, I think, would be a case to study and see how spectacularly my theory fails and why it does.
Before I go to Bruce, for any follow-up you may have on Yemen or anything else, and then we'll go to audience questions. But I wanted to, if you don't mind, take the prerogative to introduce one set of vignettes from my trips to Ukraine during the last 2 years, which I think fit very nicely within this conversation and mostly reaffirm your theory, Jay, but also show the potential for some of the dynamics that you mentioned that prevent it from being a unified field theory of everything. And these are mostly based on my impressions. But I went to Ukraine in September 2022 and September 2023. And it was striking to observe the Ukrainian population. I don't want to claim that I had a perfect gauge of their reaction. But both times I was in Kyiv and not in frontline areas. And in 2022, we did a think tank trip, and we were just in and out in one day. We stayed one night overnight, and there was a lot of tension because the war was new and nobody had gotten sort of used to it. And nobody wanted to stay, even in Kyiv, longer than necessary. We had a lot of practice in sort of self-defense measures and a lot of reassuring levels of security to make sure that we would be fine. And it was obviously uneventful, and we were just there for a day. Ukrainians live there every day, so I'm not trying to say that our experience somehow means that much. But as I looked around Ukraine, there was this sense that people were still adjusting to the war, but also knew they were pretty far from the front line. The following September 2023, I think we went even at the very beginning of September. This was a trip that General Petraeus sponsored or took me along with the Cypher group that does the Cypher brief. And also we were part of the Yalta Economic Forum, which now takes place not in Yalta, but in Kyiv. And it was a beautiful late summer period. And I was struck by the activity, traffic jams, kids at school, people in indoor, outdoor restaurants, beer gardens. People were sort of taking in that last week of summer and with relative unafraidedness. And it felt sort of like, people had gotten used to the war, gotten used to the occasional missile strikes. But then, of course, the Russians took a new strategy a few weeks later and started bombing electricity and power and heating facilities. And not so much through pure terror, but through the inconvenience and pain of an unpleasant winter made the Ukrainian people suffer in a way that now seems to really be wearing on Ukrainian will, now that they anticipate perhaps yet another winter like that. And you talked about the Qatari effort in the potential of a sort of semi-ceasefire on this front, which underscores, I think, again, that even if the pure terror effect has weakened with time, the psychological toll of having to live in the dark and in the cold for long winters is still very much on people's minds. So anyway, I'll stop there, but I think it shows sort of the nuance of your theory, and just wanted to see if you wanted to react as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. So Dan Byman, right? I mean, we want to get him into, and he has this nice book on coercion. He says, well, we always look at this 0-1 paradigm again. Delta X is what we should be looking at, right? I mean, it won't win the war, but people are tired enough. Maybe that will lead to some sort of trigger for a bargain. That assumes, again, the Ukrainians are willing to make that bargain, and they think their core interest or version of their core interest is not at play. So I'm glad you thought there were the elements in that conflict that fits in. And what's very clear is the Ukrainians really have diverted air defenses from the front lines to cities to safeguard their energy infrastructure. That has actually happened. It's well documented. So even that trivial effect may be valuable enough from a war fighting strategy, even if it's not decisive. Which is what the book is trying to say. Right? I mean, you can't win wars, but you can maybe change the course of wars using these weapons.
Thank you. Bruce, any further comments or thoughts from you, my friend?
Certainly. I would like to note that the U.S. military, in conducting this operation against the Houthis, has been very candid about what the results have been. There's been no inflated statements that, we've got them on the run. Vice Admiral George Wickoff, who is CENTCOM's naval commander, came out and said, yes, we think we've degraded their capabilities, but it's absolutely clear we have not stopped their military capabilities. And secondly, he pointed out there is no military solution to the Houthi threat to shipping in the Red Sea. There can only be a diplomatic and political solution. I would argue that the Houthis have emerged as one of the big winners of the Israel-Gaza conflict. Prior to this conflict, the Houthis were always very public in expressing their hatred for the United States and their hatred for Israel, but they'd actually never done anything. They never struck Israel once, and with very limited effect, they'd never done anything to the United States. Now they actually have, and in that sense, they have validated their legitimacy to the audience that it matters to them, which is the Zaidi Shia community in Yemen. Now, of course, all this has come at an enormous cost to the Yemeni people. The Saudi war and the Saudi blockade that accompanied it led to a humanitarian crisis of enormous proportions in Yemen. Thankfully, we've got the ceasefire in 2022, and a significant amount of credit for that has to go out to the Biden administration, which made ending the war a high priority. It's ironic that we now see them engaged in their own war against the Yemenis. But all of this has come at a significant cost to the Yemeni people. I would make one other comment on the Lebanon-Hezbollah war today. Like Jay, I expected that Hezbollah would be able to fire far more rockets into Israel than they have so far. I have to credit the Israel Defense Forces. They've obviously prepared extensively for this conflict and have done significant damage to Hezbollah. But at the final end of the day, 70,000 Israelis in northern Israel in the Galilee have been displaced from their homes. And there's really no prospect that they're going to be able to go to their homes until there is a real ceasefire with Hezbollah. It may only be 75 rockets a day, but if you live in the northern Galilee, you just can't live there anymore. And that's really unprecedented in Israeli history. We've never seen an Arab enemy actually forced Israelis to leave their homes and go find shelter someplace else, and that's expensive. The Israeli state is paying for all of those 70,000 people to stay in hotels or to stay with friends. They're obviously not working. It's a significant impact on the state of Israel. You combine that with the impact on the port city of Eilat, and this war is having serious economic damage to the Israeli state.
Jay, any comment there?
Oh, I agree with everything. I mean,
Okay, excellent.
perfect. Yeah.
Perfect. So here's where we stand. I have a few audience questions, which I'm going to merge into one mega question for Jay, and then give Sarah and Bruce the opportunity to comment briefly if they wish as well. And then I think we'll wrap up. And so thank you for the audience questions. A number I think have already been addressed because some were sent in before the event. But the two that strike me as still worthy of more detailed and direct examination are the following. One was about comparing your treatment of rockets, missiles, and drones to the massive aerial bombardment campaigns of World War II. And of course, you have a chapter in the book on that, and you've already alluded to it a couple of times, but maybe to ask you to more directly compare for maybe the three big bombing campaigns of World War II, the German Blitz against Britain in the summer of 1940 after the fall of France, when people were worried that Britain was next and maybe that the Germans would try to invade. And then, of course, as the war went on, the Allied bombardments of Germany and Japan. And these, of course, caused massive numbers of casualties. And even in northern France, in preparation for D-Day, there were a lot of unintended casualties among French citizens. So to compare the magnitude of what happened in the air campaign and its effects on the war to the more limited, but as you point out, psychologically quite important effects of the V-1 and V-2 rockets and cruise missiles that Germany would be able to launch towards the war's end. So that was one big set of questions. And the other, again, you've already touched on, had to do with comparing rockets, missiles, and drones to more traditional methods of terrorism. And Sarah's gotten at this a little bit with you, and you talked about it a little bit yourself earlier on, and you made reference to 9/11 and also to the kamikazes in World War II. But any more specific sense about comparing and contrasting rockets, missiles, and drones on the one hand with suicide bombs or, other kinds of sort of more traditional, if you will, terrorist attacks? So those are the two big outstanding questions. If you want to comment further on either one, then we'll go to Sarah and Bruce, and then we'll wrap.
Sure. And I'll be very quick on both. So again, the air power, the traditional air power bombing in World War II, and now again, this book isn't a challenge for traditional air power theory, right? I mean, if the argument is that air power didn't win the war, I'm with them, right? I mean, of course it didn't win the war, but and there were people who claimed you could, and they've been proven wrong. But that is very different from, did air power have meaningful effect on the war? And my answer would be yes, significantly meaningful effect. But how does that relate to my theory, right? I mean, is it purely bombing, military denial, or is it a psychological fear, a punishment strategy? And as I alluded to earlier, Mike, historians have done fantastic work on this. When I kept digging and anticipating a pushback from air power theory angle, I had to go and see. And I'm forgetting names here, but there is a scholar from Columbia, historian who has this, I think, Wages of Destruction, Adam Tooze, if I remember correctly, is one example. But there's quite a few where people have documented how our efforts to bomb German cities and German industry provoked the Germans to take a whole bunch of diversionary effects, military and economical, that weaken their war-fighting effect. So it's got four more variables rather than directly saying, I bomb the ball bearing factory, they can't fly planes. It's, I deny them petroleum, they have to choose between X and Z, their industrial productivity goes down, or they can fly less planes, and they make these choices. And that has been documented surprisingly well with historians. And so I think that's the connection here, right? I mean, even with air power bombing, you can see these effects, the fear, the demand for action. In fact, in the chapter on World War II, when I talk about missiles, Hitler often yells at his Air Force leaders because he doesn't have a means to hit back to what the British have done in their bombing because the Air Force is down. I mean, so he wants to hit back. Even Hitler, for all his absolute goals, wants to respond to his cities being burnt. Hamburg, I think he talks explicitly about the Hamburg bombing and how he wants to get back at it. So the phenomena plays out, but I think in different ways. And there are good historians who can do a much better job of explaining how the phenomena plays out than I do. I looked at the bombing operations, but very slightly. I talk about the Doolittle raids a little bit as being one of the phenomena where a small military action induces fear and causes a whole bunch of changes. So that's my answer to question one. On question two, can you reframe the question two for me, Mike? This was
Sure. Well, it basically amounts to comparing, these aerial threats and unmanned aerial threats to more traditional methods of terrorism, if you will. And is there any bottom line about which is more effective, which is more psychologically powerful?
Okay. So I don't know if I can compare it from, an apples to apples perspective. I think a lot of my argument, in fact, the argument, the decision to situate it as provocation and not purely coercion was because I borrowed from the terrorism literature, right? I mean, the distinction is very minute. And in fact, Bob Pape, in his book on suicidal terrorism, calls it actually coercion, right? To him, suicidal terrorism is coercion, not provocation. So I think the phenomena is very similar in terms of how it works. People have safe zones, and when those safe zones are breached in surprising ways, they demand to be reassured, which is essentially the terrorism argument, right? You probabilistically evaluate the threat much higher than you need to do, and you demand a response, and governments often always overreact. I think that connection, in fact, is very strong. And I have to admit that I shamelessly borrowed that logic to my argument, build on the scholarship of scholars. So that's the connection. I don't know which one would be more effective if a non-state actor had both, say, traditional terrorism means and or aerospace weapons, which would be more effective is in terms of effect, I am not sure. I don't think I can tease it out. But in terms of ability to execute, like Hamas and Hezbollah early on were much more traditional terrorism. And I think they navigated to aerospace weapons because Israel had denied certain means and had laid out defensive perimeters, which aerospace weapons can breach much more easily than, say, suicide terrorism or gunmen. So I think rogue state actors would adapt, so would weaker actors, because again, using it would be much easier in terms of aerospace weapons.
And of course, October 7th could be the exception that proves the rule, in the sense that it took an enormous amount of planning and preparation for Hamas to pull off that terrible, heinous attack. Sarah, any final words from you, my friend?
Yeah, I was wondering about policy recommendations that come from this. I mean, my comments so far have been kind of up here, conceptual, but what's, is there anything that you would say comes out of this in terms of actionable policy recommendations? I think probably what you wouldn't say is that, because this could come from your argument, that states should deliberately exploit the psychological vulnerabilities as part of their military strategy. But what do you think a policymaker should read out of this?
And Jay, before you answer that, why don't I give Bruce his chance to add a last word, and then we'll let you do the final tying of everything together. Bruce.
I am struck that the United States has itself used aerospace weapons quite effectively. And the specific example I would use is the war against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan in the first Obama administration. The drones, as Sarah alluded to, created an atmosphere of fear in the population, that they were being watched constantly. And when the drones were used to actually fire at targets on the ground, they were remarkably successful. I don't think that the drone warfare has been given as much credit as it really deserves. Obviously, the commando raid into Abbottabad that led to Osama bin Laden being brought to justice for good gets a lot of attention. But that succeeded because of a larger war against al-Qaeda in the region carried out by the U.S. Using drones, and was remarkably successful. The question mark now is, with no American bases in Afghanistan anymore, will al-Qaeda, or is al-Qaeda now regenerating in that area and become a threat again to the United States? I don't have a good handle on how serious that problem is, but it's something I'm very concerned about.
Thank you, Bruce. Jay, over to you for last words.
All right, fantastic. Thanks again, Mike, Sarah, and Bruce. So, policy lessons, what can we think? One of the ways I framed this policy argument for this book when it was written was, well, we need to be worried about North Korea, we need to be worried about Iran, we need to be worried about China, right? I mean, those are the big actors with serious missile, rocket, and drone capacity the US would face. And the way I've talked about policy recommendation in the book was, people tend to think missile defenses can solve the problem, all right? Counterforce bombing can solve the problem. And I've said no, right? I mean, there are limits to what it can do. Ultimately, if you have to diffuse this threat, you have to bargain, or you have to be able to physically occupy and extinguish the threat. So I think that is worth highlighting here. There's a lot of wars going on, and there are points in time where missile defenses seem spectacular. In other times, it doesn't seem so. And I think it's worth, again, reiterating that missile defenses or air defenses have limits, and they don't solve all of this problem. The other policy recommendation I would talk about, especially with North Korea in mind, is allies, whether they be in Asia or in Europe, would want very different things than what we would want in a crisis situation. They'd want protection, we'd want quick victory. The 91 Gulf War being an example, and Israelis wanted very different things than what we wanted. World War II was the same case, and to be able to work through that bargain is a challenge for alliance politics. And I think one of the policy recommendations to be prepared for that. That if North Korea launches missiles in South Korea, what we want as the US, as a military force, would be very different from what South Koreans want to be protected from. They may want to eliminate the threat quickly. They may want to have protection and elimination at the same time. So that bargaining is something I think policymakers should be aware of. Those were two big things I claimed in the book. Although I have to think I like Sarah's idea quite well, right? I mean, if we were a weaker party and we had to engage in a conflict, can we actually play the psychology of fear to our advantage? I did not talk about that in my book, Sarah, but I think it's a nice argument to think through. I mean, can this actually be a strategy?
In closing, I'll just say I think also the potential for a drone threat against the United States is going to have to be more on our minds in the future. As we think about ballistic missile defense, we may have to broaden our aperture to think about drones as well. And let me also thank Sarah Krebs from Cornell University, who runs the Tech Policy Center there and is professor of government and at the Cornell Brooks Policy School, Bruce Rydell, whose book on this topic, America in the Yemens, is excellent, and I recommend it. But most of all, Jay, congratulations again, Jay Sankaran, with his book, Bombing to Provoke, and an excellent discussion today. Very nice historical cases, a very tightly and cogently presented theory of the case for how to think about rockets, missiles, and drones in modern warfare. So with all of that, it's not a quick, easy segue to say happy Thanksgiving, but I will nonetheless wish all of you and our viewers and audience a good holiday, and thank you for joining us today. So signing off from Brookings, over and out.